Hey guys, welcome back to our Jesus Myth or Messiah study. We are discussing week 2. Did Jesus exist? Do we have any proof or any evidence? How do we know whether or not Jesus was a real living, breathing human being? How do we know that he actually existed outside of the Bible? Do we have any proof? How do we know, other than just exercising faith, whether or not Jesus was a living, breathing human being? And this is the first baseline question that we're going to discuss and cover in order to get to more in-depth questions like, was he the Son of God? And other questions of that, but a little bit of a deeper nature. So today we're going to cover credibility. We're going to talk about the importance of it. We're going to talk about the source that I have. We're going to look at a little bit of evidence. Evidence being Cornelius Tacitus, Lucian of Samosata, Flavius Josephus, Pliny the Younger, Celus, Gaius Sutonius Tranquillus, the Talmud. We're going to talk about just a little question, something to think about, and then just give a summary of what we covered today. So we had a discussion. We said, what is credibility? And we got answers like it's, knowing that information is legitimate, the source can be trusted, it's a relevant source, and the information is going to be good. That's credibility. And so to kind of get a little more in detail about what credibility is, we said, Darian claims that when he was 8 years old, he saved an old lady from a burning building. All right, and we want to verify this information. We want to know if this story is true or not. So what information would we need to find out if what he's saying is true? And what are some sources of information we could use? So we would need what? Well, we'd need to know when was Darian 8 years old. So we'd need a date or a time when Darian was 8 years old. And so we could find that out from him pretty easily, or from, birth documents or whatever. And what other information we need would be, okay, well, where was this burning building? What state, what city, what town, where was it? What was the address of it? And then once we got, a date when it supposedly happened, the address, we could find out, we could look at news sources. News sources would be a great way to find out if this actually happened, because this would be a newsworthy event. So how do we know what news source to go with? Every city, every town has different news sources, and different areas and different states have different news stations and things of that nature. So we need to find out where it happened. So date, time, where it happened, and that'll all be great information. And news would be highly credible and highly reliable information to find out whether or not this actually happened, right? And so somebody said, this is a perfect example actually, somebody said, well, we could ask Darian's parents. But that poses the question, well, say that Darian wasn't telling the truth, and his parents are pretty close to him, and they might not want him to look like a liar, so they might be a little biased, right? So even if it's not true, they might say, oh yeah, he did that, and have their own personal reasons for maybe not wanting to tell the truth in their circumstance. And so we also talked about bias and things that ruin credibility, which is a personal agenda. So the information we'd need is where it happened, when it happened, and we would need credible sources, like not necessarily his parents, but we would need, maybe a news article, right, or a news report or something of that nature. And what would we want? We would want information that is credible. So how do we know if it's credible? So we kind of discussed it. We considered, if somebody, I'm not going to ask somebody a question about this event who lives in Antarctica, right? Or on the other side of the world, or who wasn't alive at the time, or really has no relevant knowledge. They weren't there at the time, or they were just so external to the situation that they really don't have any credible input into it, right? So the people that we ask are extremely important, and that will let us know if the information is credible or not. So we need to be careful when we're looking at information. So when doing an investigation, credibility is absolutely everything. And just to reiterate, credible means it's accurate, it's authentic, it's legitimate, it's trusted. So the source. So we live in a day and time where we have more knowledge at our fingertips than anyone has ever had in history. We can ask any question right now and get an answer from this little device in our pockets, and it only takes seconds. So think about that. Let that sink in for a minute. You have got more information, more knowledge available at your fingertips than anyone ever has all throughout history. And that's a pretty amazing thing to comprehend, and I think it's something that we really take for granted. So we have to do a lot of research to prepare for these studies. We aren't giving information based off of our opinions or what we think to be true. But we verify information, so we do our research in order to prepare. And we usually have to compile information from different credible sources, and we put it all together in a coherent and a relevant way in order to present it to you guys so that we can really understand and have a conversation that makes sense and that's true. And every now and then, so I come across a gold mine of information regarding a certain topic, and this week I absolutely did. So in my search for information, when I was doing research for today's topic, so I found non-biblical evidence as proof for Jesus Christ on YouTube by Biblical Accuracy channel on YouTube. And this is where I got all of my information and my quotes, and some of it is just verbatim for today's topic. So if you want more in-depth detail on the subject matter, it's literally all from non-biblical evidence as proof for Jesus Christ, which is a 4-part video on YouTube that was put up there by Bible Accuracy channel. Every now and then you come across information like this, and it is out there where you just get straightforward, credible, reliable information. So it's not necessary to dig elsewhere, especially for the topic that we're covering today. This was certainly enough good information where I didn't need to pull from any sources. So while I do feel cheap in doing research, you'll find that it's really wasn't necessary for me to try to pull from anywhere else. However, Quentin brought up a good question. He said, well, how do you know that that's a credible and reliable source? Well, because I looked up the information myself on the side as well. So it's not just somebody saying, well, this is what I think. It's somebody quoting sources and presenting information from sources, and external to that, I also took the sources that they quoted and I verified them myself to make sure that I was giving you guys good information. So evidence. So today we're going to be looking at evidence from predominant historians from the time when Jesus supposedly lived. The historians we're going to be looking at are highly credible, and they're often highly skeptical of Jesus' divinity. And so we asked the question, why would they be more credible if they denied Jesus' divinity? Why would that make them more credible? Well, because it would show that they don't have a bias. Many of the people that we'll look at today were actually against Christianity, and they didn't like Jesus, but they still give evidence for the fact that he existed. And so the fact that there's a bias lacking, and maybe even a bias in the opposite direction, makes the information even more credible in reference to what we're looking at today. So these are considered some of the greatest historians throughout these areas, and they are full of integrity and they verify the truth. They don't these aren't commentators. These aren't people who are just writing artistically. These are people who are verifying the truth. They are historians. They are giving an account of things that occurred throughout history. So most of them, if not all of them, held very high political roles during their time, which means that they were accountable to others for the information, and they were very prominent, important political figures. So this isn't just Joe Schmo sitting in the basement who wrote about something he heard. So Cornelius Tacitus, who lived from 55 to 120 AD, Tacitus was a 1st and 2nd century Roman historian who lived through the reigns of half a dozen Roman emperors. He is considered one of the greatest historians of Rome, not just because of what we're going to discuss today, but because of his recording of history. So Cornelius verifies the biblical account of Jesus' execution at the hand of Pontius Pilate, who governed Judea from 26 to 36 AD during the reign of Tiberius. So Cornelius wrote, Christos, the founder of the Christian name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea, in the reign of Tiberius. But the pernicious superstition, although suppressed for a time, it broke out again, not only through Judea, where the mischief originated, but through the city of Rome also. So there are many, many important things that were written here, and it says, that Christ was the founder of the Christian name, that he was put to death by Pontius Pilate, who was, Pontius Pilate was the procurator of Judea, and it was during the reign of Tiberius. And Cornelius calls Christianity and calls Christ pernicious superstition. So you can see where he's coming from when he's discussing Jesus. He's not saying, "Oh, this great Savior" or this amazing man. He's saying, this troublemaker, so to speak. He's just trying to discredit Jesus, but also verifies that it started in Judea, it says it was where the mischief originated, but also spread through Rome, and we know that Christianity did spread through Rome also. So this is a historical document. I just want to reiterate that for us. And it does confirm that Jesus did exist, that he was the founder of Christianity, that he was put to death by Pilate, and that Christianity originated in Judea and it spread through Rome. So Tacitus was a professional historian who likely referenced government records. So he's not just talking to a bunch of Jesus' disciples or a bunch of Christians, he's referencing government records. In his writings, Tacitus makes it a point to distinguish between verified information and hearsay. He will give a disclaimer. If he believed that this account of Jesus was hearsay or folklore, or he wasn't able to verify it, he would have written a disclaimer that the account was unverified. But he never makes that disclaimer. Tacitus refers to Christianity as a superstitious and insuppressible mischief, and he was frequently condescending towards Christianity in his writing, which again is a good thing on our behalf because it shows that he's not biased, he's not in favor, he's not in support of, he's not going to try to convince any writers anything about Jesus. So Lucian of Samosata, he is extremely critical in his opinion of Christians, and he was scornful towards them. But his writing, it is proof of Christ's existence. He states, the Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites, and was crucified on that account. It was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment they are converted and deny the gods of Greece, and worship the crucified sage, and live after his laws. And he wrote this in the Death of Peregrinus, 11 through 13. So he makes a lot of statements here, and there's some criticism. Again, if you want to watch the actual video, it went over this information in great detail, and I actually went over, some objections that people have, and he addresses the objections very well in the video also, so it'd be worth looking at. So this confirms that Jesus did exist, that Jesus was the founder of Christianity, and that Jesus was worshipped by his followers, and that Jesus suffered death by crucifixion. And again, Lucian is referring to Christ as a sage, so a human who, is maybe wise or possesses powers, but he's not calling him a god. So both of these men are of high integrity in their account of history, verifying the truth with every statement. They are both highly critical of Jesus' divinity, not his existence, but there's no question about whether or not he existed. They're both plainly stating that he existed. At the time of these writings, Christians were trying to prove Jesus' divinity, not that he existed. During this time, it was common knowledge that Jesus existed. Nobody argued whether or not he existed. They argued about whether or not he was divine, whether or not he was the Son of God. Now that time has passed throughout history, and we've gotten further and further away from this time, now people are starting to try to make arguments saying that he never existed to begin with. But as we see here, we have many sources that would suggest otherwise. So Flavius Josephus from 37 to 100 AD. So Flavius was a first-century Roman Jewish scholar and historian who was born in Jerusalem. He was a prominent historian who was likely to have interviewed the apostles themselves. What an honor that must have been, although he was skeptic. He said, now there was about this time a wise man, Jesus, if it is lawful to call him a man, for he is a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him from the cross, those who love him at first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribes of Christians so named for him are not extinct at this day. So this confirms that Jesus lived in the first century, that Jesus performed miracles, and that Jesus was a teacher, and some believed him to be the Christ. He had many followers, he was tried by Pilate, and he was crucified, and he was the brother of James. We can see that in the later writings, not in this particular passage. So Pliny the Younger, from 61 to 113 AD. Pliny the Younger, he was a lawyer, he was an author, and he was a magistrate of ancient Rome. So Pliny admits to torturing and executing Christians who refused to deny Christ. Those who denied the charges and denied Christ were spared in order to exalt the Roman gods and curse the name of Christ. So this is somebody who's not just skeptical of Jesus' divinity, but somebody who sought out to punish and torture and kill people who claimed that Jesus Christ was the Son of God and the Messiah. So Pliny addresses his concerns in letters to Emperor Trajan that too many Christians were being killed for the refusal to deny their faith. He was actually concerned for the number of people that were being killed for refusing to deny Christ. That's what he did, and he was saying, man, there Emperor Trajan, there are too many people. There are too many people who are being killed. And so it would be highly unreasonable for people who know that Jesus never really existed, or who didn't know that Jesus was real. It would be highly unreasonable for them to be willing to die. You can look up, pictures. I wouldn't recommend it, but you can look up pictures, and the way that these people were tortured is horrifying. It's horrifying, and that they would undergo hours and hours of torture until they were dead ultimately. For a being who never really existed, who wasn't real, that'd be just completely absurd. So Celus was a second century Roman author and avid opponent of Christianity. He was a very important figure in this discussion because of the volume of his writings, his intention to completely disprove Christianity as well. He was very hostile, and he made very hostile accusations against Christianity. So, Pliny the Younger was obviously extremely hostile to Christianity, but we know that Celus was also. But he writes on Jesus' miracles, Jesus, on account of his poverty, was hired out to go to Egypt. While there, he acquired certain powers. He returned home highly elated at possessing these powers, and on the strength of them gave himself out to be a god. It was by means of sorcery that he was able to accomplish the wonders which he performed. Let us believe that these cures, or the resurrection, or the feeding of a multitude with a few loaves, these are nothing more than tricks of jugglers. It is by the name of certain demons and by the use of incantations that the Christians appear to be possessed of miraculous power. So, Celus, he says a tremendous amount of this. He's obviously skeptical of Jesus' divinity because he says he makes himself out to be a god. And he admits that Jesus had powers, but he doesn't say that it's because, he's the Son of God. He says it's because he's using incantations and he's calling on the name of demons. But he does verify that Jesus existed, that Jesus worked miracles, that Jesus had followers, and he also talked about something, a miracle that we heard in the New Testament as well, which is feeding the multitude with a few loaves, which is really cool to see in a document that's external to the Bible, even for me. He acknowledges Jesus' birth, but denies his divinity, of course. So Gaius Sutonius Tranquillus from 69 to 130 AD. He was a prominent Roman historian who chronicled the reigns of Roman Caesars and historical events that surrounded the reigns. He was a court official who served under Hadrian and as an annalist for the imperial house. He records the expulsion of Christian Jews from Rome, which we have mentioned in Acts 18:2. He confirms that the Christian faith was founded by Jesus. He writes, as the Jews were making constant disturbances at the instigation of Christus, which was Christ, Claudius expelled them from Rome, which he writes in the Life of Claudius 25.4. So the last one we're going to discuss today, at least I think it's the last one, is the Talmud, which is an ancient record of Jewish history, laws, and teaching. Although it denies the divinity of Jesus, it does chronicle that he was hanged, which is an idiom of crucifixion. So it states, on the eve of the Passover, Jesus was hanged 40 days before the execution. A herald went forth and cried, he is being stoned because he has practiced sorcery and has enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say anything in his favor, let them come forward and plead on his behalf. But since nothing was brought forward, he was hanged on the eve of Passover. We just looked at a lot of sources that, at the very least, address the question that we covered today, which is, did Jesus exist? And we find historical records of, non-Christian, non-believers, credible historians who clearly show that Jesus was a living, breathing human being. He existed. So there are many other writers, historians who wrote regarding Jesus, his life, his death, etc., not including all the letters in the New Testament. So there are many, many, many other sources, historical sources that mention Jesus, that talk about Jesus' life and his crucifixion and so on and so forth. We certainly didn't have time to mention all of them today. So think about this. Socrates only exists in the writings of his students. There is not a single document still in existence that contains his original works. If we applied the same logic that skeptics use to determine Jesus' historicity, we must assume that Socrates was a figment of the imagination of his students. But if we accept Socrates as a historical figure, and we do, based on 4 secondary accounts, we must also accept Jesus as a historical figure whose life was documented by his disciples, many historians, and those who reject his divine claim. We avoided using biblical evidence to support Jesus' existence. Early Christian historians and eyewitnesses were unanimous in their accounts that several New Testament books were written by eyewitnesses of both Jesus and the apostolic ministries. If these authors were indeed eyewitnesses, we can believe that they also provide evidence of the historicity of Jesus. So we talked about some historical figures who verified that Jesus was a living, breathing human being, but we also have the New Testament and the apostles who were eyewitnesses to Jesus, of Jesus. So in summary, there are many credible and authentic historical sources that clearly show that Jesus existed. On that surface level question, without even needing to open up the Bible, we can see that Jesus absolutely existed. So today we had a lot of other information verified, especially regarding the crucifixion, and we'll get to that information, those questions later on regarding Jesus. But today we were focusing on whether or not he existed, and we can absolutely safely and accurately conclude that Jesus definitely existed, without question. So an interesting thing is this new argument that Jesus never existed is only posed by people who are ignorant of what's out there. People who are atheists, people who deny Jesus' divinity, who are scholars, they admit that Jesus existed. That's not something that they argue because they know the information that's out there and they are smart enough to not deny that Jesus existed. It's people who don't know what's out there. It's people who aren't scholars, people who just have their own opinions that say, oh, well, Jesus never even existed. That's a new argument. Just something to think about today. Thank you guys for taking the time to watch this video. I hope you go and watch the original video, the original source that I got this information from, because it's extremely, extremely worth it. I hope you guys got something out of this today. God bless you for taking the time. Stay tuned for next week's video. I think we'll be talking about a little bit more about how do we know who Jesus was, was supposed to be, which is kind of a broad question, but we'll get into that in more detail. But again, thank you guys for taking the time. I hope you got something out of it, and God bless you. We'll see you this week.